Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mina Rose. I'm the project coordinator for the CWC Coalition, and we are happy to welcome everyone to our webinar today on the future of Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. Today's webinar is very timely, and we are joined by two experts in the field, Gregory Koblentz and Natasha Hall. So I will briefly explain just the way that the webinar will work and then introduce our speakers. So we will first have a presentation by the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, Daryl Kimball, who will give us an overview of the last decade or so of Syrian chemical weapons, the program. And then we will have a presentation by Gregory Koblentz, followed by Natasha Hall, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end of about 30 minutes. When you have questions that you'd like to ask, we ask that you please put your questions in the Q&A, use the Q&A function rather than the chat, and we'll be fielding the questions and asking them directly to the panelists. So please put all of your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them. So first, I'd like to just explain for anyone who's new or hasn't heard of us before, the CWC Coalition is an independent international network of civil society that's committed to upholding the Chemical Weapons Convention and supporting the work of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We work in association with the Arms Control Association, and we host webinars throughout the year, as well as newsletters and other kinds of information and updates related to chemical weapons issues. So if you're interested, please visit our website at cwccoalition.org. So now, without further ado, a little bit about the speakers that we have today. So first, we will be joined by Daryl Kimball from the Arms Control Association.
Well, thank you very much, Mina, and thank you for Greg Koblentz and Natasha Hall for joining us this morning. You'll hear more about them, and you'll hear from them in a moment. As we look at the future of Syria's chemical weapons program, we thought it would be useful to look back a little bit on some of the key points of the past history, because it's hard to understand the situation today without recalling some of the key events that go back more than a decade. And it's also important, as we address the subject of Syria's chemical weapons, to acknowledge the reality that over the course of the horrific years-long civil war, the government of Bashar al-Assad and his Russian allies, extremist fighters, have committed numerous war crimes. More than 600,000 people died, more than 13 million people were displaced, and just one of the many heinous aspects of the war was the repeated use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime beginning in 2012. And as you'll recall, many of you might recall from that time, there was significant concern that Syria's large and sophisticated chemical arsenal, which was not acknowledged at the time but was well known about, might be used against Israel or other Syrian neighbors, or it might fall into the hands of extremist fighters or even be transferred to another country. Then we saw that in August of 2013, the regime launched a massive sarin gas attack, a nerve gas attack that killed more than 1,400 of Assad's own people in the Damascus suburbs of Ghouta, as the regime tried to repel rebel fighters and their supporters from positions near the capital. And this attack was met with global condemnation, and although the US Congress hesitated to provide support for military action, it did raise the very strong possibility of US military strikes against suspected Syrian chemical weapons production and storage sites. But then, just within a few weeks, Russian and US diplomats, in a rare instance of cooperation on a common threat that is even rarer today, had worked out a tentative plan whereby Syria would agree to place its chemical weapons under international control and dismantle them, and for the United States not to conduct a military strike against the country. So on September 10th, just about a month after the horrific sarin gas attack, The Assad regime welcomed the plan, and they agreed days later to accede to the 1997 Chemical Weapons Convention and to say that they would observe the CWC obligations immediately. That left it up to US and Russian negotiators in cooperation with the UN Secretary General's office and the OPCW to come up with a detailed plan for accounting, inspection, and control, and the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons in the middle of a raging civil war. And so within a month, in October, the plan had been developed, and a team of OPCW and Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and UN officials arrived in Syria to begin the process for destruction, accounting and destruction elimination. And remarkably, by October of 2014, just a year later, nearly all of Syria's declared chemical agents and precursor chemicals had been safely and irreversibly destroyed. The OPCW that fall in 2014 confirmed that almost 98% of Syria's declared chemical stockpile of 1,300 metric tons of sulfur mustard agent precursor chemicals for nerve gas had been removed and destroyed in 4 countries and aboard a specially outfitted ship, the MV Cape Ray, a US ship that neutralized about half of the stockpile. This was an enormously difficult and complex operation. As I said, it took place in the middle of the ongoing civil war, the refusal of Syria to cover the costs of demilitarization, and ongoing allegations and actual use of continued and indiscriminate chemical weapons use by the Syrian regime and later by ISIS forces against populations in Syria. Nevertheless, Syria, with Russia's help after this point, stymied efforts by the OPCW and member states to get a full accounting of Syria's arsenal and to allow for further verification measures to make sure that the program was completely shut down. All of the precursor materials were accounted for. And then, of course, as we saw since that remarkable demilitarization operation between 2013 and 14, the Assad regime continued to use chlorine-laced barrel bombs on civilian and rebel targets as weapons of terror. And in 2017, the regime launched one more sarin gas attack, or at least 2 sarin gas attacks after 2017. So fast forward to today, with the Assad regime out of the picture and the country in a rebuilding and reconciliation mode, difficult matters, very difficult matters, the return of refugees, the new Syrian government and the international community face the challenge of ensuring that the remnants of Assad's chemical stockpile are indeed accounted for and eliminated. So that is what the majority of this webinar is going to be focused on. And with that, let me turn things over first to Greg Koblentz. Mina, if you could introduce Greg, and then we'll hear from Greg about the current situation and where we stand with this challenging situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So our next presenter will be Greg Koblentz. He's an associate professor and director of the Biodefense Graduate Program at George Mason University, the Schar School of Policy and Government. He's also co-director of the Global Biolabs Initiative that tracks high containment labs and biorisk management policies around the world, a member of the Scientist Working Group on Biological and Chemical Security at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation, and a member of the Security Working Group of the Engineering Biology Research Consortium. His research focuses on understanding the causes and consequences of the proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons to state and non-state actors. He's published articles on Syria's use of chemical weapons in foreign policy, foreign affairs, the Non-Proliferation Review, and War on the Rocks. He serves as a pro bono advisor for the Open Society Justice Initiative on their Syria Chemical Weapons Accountability Project, as a consultant for the Stimson Center on a project on Russian disinformation, and is a member of the Biothreat Advisory Board of Eleusis Therapeutics. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Daryl. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the future of Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. And Daryl provided a very good overview of how we got to where we are today. So I want to start off talking a bit about what we think about what is still left in Syria in terms of their chemical weapons program. Are the slides up? I can't see the slides, but I don't know if they're up and I just can't see them or not. Okay, I'll just keep going and hope that they, all right, there we go. So where we are today, if you go to the next slide, is that the OPCW still has a lot of questions about what Syria might still have, even after 10 years of inspections, investigations, and attempt to verify Syria's declaration. The OPCW has uncovered a lot of undeclared activities and materials, forcing the Syrians to revise their declaration about 17 times over the last 10 years. But when the Assad regime collapsed in December of 2024, the OPCW still had 19 unresolved issues with Syria. And these unresolved issues had to do with the full range of Syrian chemical weapon capabilities, from research and development to production to weaponization. For example, there are precursors, chemical warfare agents, and munitions that Syria declared in 2013, but they can never really properly account for and prove to the OPCW that they had been destroyed or consumed. So, for example, Syria claimed to have used up an excessively large number of precursors and munitions during testing, but the OPCW could never verify those activities. In addition, the OPCW has had longstanding concerns that Syria did not fully declare all components of its program. So, for example, Syria claimed that it did not produce enough munitions to weaponize the 385 tons of sulfur mustard that it has admitted to producing, which really makes no sense. Syria also claims it never produced any tactical munitions such as artillery rounds or short-range rockets, but we know that Syria has used improvised rockets to deliver sarin, as in the attack in Ghouta that Daryl just mentioned. There's also evidence that Syria obtained new precursors and materials to rebuild its production facilities. And after the Assad regime fell, Israel launched around 500 airstrikes on Syrian military facilities, including facilities formerly associated with the chemical weapons program at Barza and Jabalia, but these were known facilities. So it's unlikely there's much left at those locations. So there's still a lot of questions about what is left over in Syria in terms of their chemical weapons capabilities. Next slide, please. So given these known unknowns, there are a range of threats posed by Syria's remaining chemical weapons capabilities. The first threat is that while the new Syrian government has said that it's opposed to chemical weapons and will cooperate with the OPCW, we haven't seen a lot of concrete steps in this regard yet. And I know Natasha is going to address this more in her comments. Putting aside the comments that have been made so far by the new Syrian government, right, there is a risk that they might change their mind, decide to keep these weapons as a deterrent or some kind of insurance policy. Now, I think that's unlikely, but we can't entirely discount it. And so it's more likely they'll use these chemical weapons as bargaining chips for things that it really cares about, like sanctions relief and reconstruction aid. But we can't just assume that the government will fully cooperate and turn everything over to OPCW. So we need to kind of keep this in mind. The second threat is that whatever is remaining in Syria could be stolen by non-state actors. And this risk will remain high as long as the government lacks control over all of Syria. There are two specific threats that I want to mention here. First, after the fall of Assad, a pro-Ba'athist group composed of former regime elements calling itself the Syrian Popular Resistance emerged and has been active in the coastal provinces. This is worrisome because this group has the potential of members who actually have knowledge about chemical weapons and operates in Latakia and Tartus provinces, which are the locations that are most likely to house whatever hidden Syrian chemical weapons capabilities are left over from the Assad regime. The second threat is that posed by ISIS, which is less likely since they're in the eastern part of the country, but the Islamic State has a long history of developing and using chemical weapons, so they do have some expertise and they've demonstrated interest in these kinds of weapons. So that is still something we need to be very careful about. The third risk is that of brain drain. The Syrian chemical weapons program employed roughly 300 scientists, engineers, and technicians who worked for the Scientific Studies and Research Center, which was the heart of the Syrian chemical weapons program. They're now all unemployed, potentially fugitives, potentially wanted for war crimes. So they might either try and flee the country or sell their services to terrorist groups or rogue states in order to support themselves. So the brain drain from the chemical weapons program is another threat we have to take seriously. And then finally, there is a risk that precursors, production equipment, and munitions might be smuggled out of the country into one of Syria's neighbors, either for purely profit-driven motives by smugglers, or it might wind up in the hands of terrorist groups or militia groups that operate in the region. So this is another area of concern about what's left over from the former Syrian chemical weapons program. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about what the OPCW needs and wants to do, and then talk very briefly about the role of other international organizations. So first, the obvious priority is for the OPCW to locate and secure all of Syria's remaining chemical weapon capabilities, which will require a new declaration from Syria. A likely challenge here is that those in Syria with the most knowledge of their former chemical weapons program are also going to be the hardest to find, and at least willing to talk, given their potential complicity in war crimes. And so this is going to be a challenge to balance the need for information to deal with this stockpile, and balancing that with the need for justice and accountability. That's still very much an open question. Once the OPCW has a new declaration, it'll be the job of the Declaration Assessment Team, which has been operating for the last 10 years, to verify that declaration. Hopefully they will have access to new information, conduct new interviews, and be able to get to the bottom of all these unresolved issues that they've been pursuing for the last several years. And as part of that verification process, the OPCW will need to be involved with securing facilities until such a time that they can be destroyed or removed. The security situation in Syria now is definitely better than it was in 2013, 2014, but it's by no means stable, and that will remain an important influence on the course of OPCW's ability to operate in the country. And the OPCW will need more resources in order to achieve this mission, since this will still likely be a major undertaking and will require more inspectors, specialized equipment, and more funding to accomplish fully. In addition to destruction, the other priority is that of accountability. And the OPCW already has two mechanisms set up to identify and investigate chemical attacks in Syria. One's the fact-finding mission, and the other is the investigation identification team. Both these groups should now have access to more documents, more individuals that they can interview to find out what really happened, and shed light on previous chemical weapons attacks. We've already seen some individuals come forward with more information about the attack on Douma in 2018. And so there is definitely some more opportunities here to better document previous Syrian chemical attacks. And that is also, there's going to be a long-term need here by Syria for assistance in putting in place national implementing legislation and improving the safety and security of civilian chemical infrastructure. So other parts of OPCW, I think, will be engaged in Syria for many years to come. There are other international organizations that can play a very important role in both the verification, destruction, accountability activities in Syria. Just to highlight a couple of them, the Chemical Security Working Group, the Global Partnership, can direct funds to the OPCW that will support all of these activities. In addition, there are a number of groups that can be help with the accountability of Syrian government officials and scientists and those officers who are involved with the developing and using chemical weapons. According to the Syrian human rights activists, they've identified already almost 400 Syrian officials, officers, and scientists who are involved with developing and using chemical weapons. And so now it becomes a question of how can these individuals be located, detained, and put on trial? And will that be done within Syria, neighboring countries, European countries that are pursuing legal proceedings already, or maybe even at the international level? International Criminal Court has met with the new Syrian government, so there's potential for Syria to sign the Rome Statute, which would then open up the door for the ICC to hold trials. The IIIM has gathered lots of evidence here, and again, more potential to gather more evidence that they can use against anyone from the former program who is able to be arrested and put on trial. And then there's also the exceptional tribunal for chemical weapons that is being stood up by a Syrian lawyer in the United Kingdom with support of a number of states, and that could be perhaps a supplement to the ICC or supplement to activities going on in Syria here. And then finally, UNICRI has put together training for national courts and prosecutors about how to actually prosecute crimes involving chemical weapons. And so they're available as a resource to help Syria or neighboring countries develop the capacity to conduct these kinds of investigations and trials in a fair and effective manner. So at the end of the day, there's a lot that needs to be done. No single nation or organization can do it all. So we're going to need to have strong international cooperation to ensure that Syria's remaining chemical weapons are destroyed safely and securely, and those responsible for conducting chemical attacks are brought to justice. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the presentations.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. So next we'll hear from Natasha Hall. Natasha is a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she managed research projects on chemical weapons and other WMDs. Prior to CSIS, Natasha has over 15 years of experience in 15 countries as an analyst, researcher, and practitioner in complex humanitarian emergencies and conflicts with a specialty in the Middle East. She worked on the Syrian conflict in mediation, civilian protection, and with the US government. Her reports have spurred congressional hearings and high-level donor responses on Syria. As a director with Mayday Rescue, she led these responses, working with the White Helmets to reinforce critical civilian infrastructure and protect civilians from explosive and chemical weapons and other consequences of the war. She's a commentator and contributor for Bloomberg, CNN, and BBC, amongst others. She's been quoted and written articles on chemical weapons and the effects of war in the Middle East for The Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, The New Yorker, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and New York Times. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Natasha.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mina, and thanks to my esteemed colleagues on the panel, but also online. I can see a lot of friends there as well. So, I mean, as Mina pointed out, I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective. I had worked on Syria for over 15 years with the White Helmets and others, and chemical weapons pretty much stumped us and stumped civilians. And so I think for that reason, we could suspect that other actors might potentially use them in the future. But we might also expect, I think, Syrians, as Greg mentioned, to really expect accountability on this file. One of the only files that they've ever really been able to get any accountability for, as a matter of fact. So I'm going to get into, I think, sort of the lay of the land on the ground as much as I possibly can without revealing too much. But Greg sort of alluded to HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who's the sort of de facto government in Damascus that fell the Assad regime, and their at least seeming cooperation with, potential inspectors coming in, et cetera. Just to get a little bit more detailed on that, actually it was the day before Assad was toppled, December 7th, that they issued a statement on X saying that they wanted international help in safely dismantling Syria's chemical weapons program. Specifically, they said the Assad regime has attacked the Syrian people with chemical weapons on dozens of occasions, causing deaths of thousands, and that HTS would specifically not allow the tragedies experienced by Syria in the past to be repeated. They also reassured the international community that they have no intention or desire to use chemical weapons or any weapons of mass destruction, and that they won't, quote, allow chemical weapons to fall into irresponsible hands. And so they expressed a readiness to cooperate with the international community on all matters related to monitoring the weapons in sensitive sites. There was quite a flurry of excitement with this in the arms control community that a designated terrorist group was so accommodating, and that perhaps this meant that the chemical weapons norm was not under threat after all. I would have a slightly different take on that. As I mentioned, I think first zooming out, though Assad fell, for 12 years, he showed how chemical weapons both toxic industrial chemicals like chlorine and sarin gas could be effective, especially with the diplomatic protection or backing of a Russia-like actor. And so I think that, or I suspect that, this will lead to others testing the norm as we move forward. And we may see the likes of RCA's, riot control agents, and toxic industrial chemicals and other chemicals sort of on the margins of the schedules of the Chemical Weapons Convention being used, as we've seen in Ukraine with choking agents more recently. The second reason I would say is that HTS is overall a pragmatic actor. This isn't an ISIS type actor. We've been dealing with them actually for quite some time in northwest Syria. They're also not currently facing an existential threat. So I think these two reasons alone would make it rational for them not to pursue chemical weapons and to tell the international community that they want to cooperate. They have good reasons to say such things and follow through. Those weapons could be used against them by former regime officials with access to them, or they could be used as leverage by those same regime officials with the international community more broadly. They could fall into the hands of other actors that might use it against them. And so they need to show that they can provide security for these weapons. I think that reliability when it comes to securing chemical weapons in Syria was actually one of the many reasons that Assad survived. The international community was worried about them falling into the hands of a non-state armed group like HTS. And HTS knows this. And so I think Shaddai has to show this kind of cooperation in order to be considered a credible and responsible actor, and to potentially have a terrorist designation removed and the myriad of sanctions on Syria also removed. We forget that Shaddai, this is the sort of de facto leader of Syria at this point, just had a $10 million bounty on his head, which I think shows how stilted, zombified our Syria policy had been, since there had definitely been cooperation on security matters with HTS when they governed Idlib. Overall cooperating on chemical weapons is in their interest at the current moment. So even though I think the norm is still under threat, I think those are promising signs, but there are still hurdles to the government bringing Syria into compliance, even if they wanted to. And Greg alluded to some of these. I'm just going to narrow down on some of them. An emergency OPCW meeting on Syria was held about a month ago in the hopes that investigators could go in quickly. That hasn't happened yet. The reason some have stated that investigators might not be able to go in is because of security reasons. This has been a problem for all accountability efforts, I should say, to track down documentation, mass graves, etc. But those security reasons should likely be reassessed, I would say, especially for known sites. Security can at least be provided in targeted areas, certainly. However, if there is a larger scale search, there could be problems. Insecurity is a huge problem if you talk to people in Damascus, somewhat, but certainly in the outskirts, it's a huge problem. And so, I think we're seeing a force that once controlled this tiny enclave in northwest Syria, now ostensibly controlling most of the country. There aren't even enough police in Damascus, let alone the surrounding areas. HTS has said that it's recruiting more people, but again, this is a bigger problem. The second issue is that Israel launched about 500 attacks, essentially annihilating Syria's military and potentially evidence for chemical weapons accountability. Given that this is at a time when Syria is being run by a foreign designated terrorist organization, it makes it difficult for any country to support them in terms of security now. And so this makes it more probable that security will deteriorate further, as it really would in any country if there wasn't a significant police presence, let alone a country that just went through a 13-year civil war. And so we're seeing some of that play out right now. And then finally, and Greg also alluded to this, if the chemical weapons are indeed hidden, which they probably are, many of them not in known facilities like Barzeh, they will need to be found through a variety of means. Investigators will need unfettered access to the country. That will be difficult, as I said, for security reasons. But there are other ways, I think, to find these remnants. One of them would be negotiations with those that have them. And that is a delicate issue, I think, for Syrians that want full accountability for the war crimes that they have seen. The other is intelligence. HTS has made relationships with all sorts over the years, including those connected to the regime officials. And so HTS and others will have a role to play in finding those remnants to destroy them safely. We know from Iraq in the 90s that Saddam had chemical weapons in civilian facilities, pesticide factories, documentation was hidden in chicken farms. But we knew a lot about WMD in Iraq because of his son-in-law who defected, but could himself be accused of being a perpetrator. So this kind of speaks to a little bit of the compromise that might need to happen. And that gets me to accountability. I think without a doubt, the Syrian people want accountability for chemical weapons attacks. And we've seen that with some victims finally being able to speak out on the attacks, particularly in Eastern Ghouta. And, just a couple of days ago, I think HTS has been saying the right things. Just a couple of days ago in an interview, Ashara announced plans for transitional justice in Syria, ensuring fair trials for those who committed atrocities, while balancing accountability with national reconciliation. And so he even outlined the formation of a judicial team, investigators, and a special directorate to locate the missing and identify those responsible for crimes. That all said, HTS has proven that they're very pragmatic actors. We've seen this with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia recently shaking hands with Ahmed Ashara, which is quite incredible. They also know, HTS knows, that they are responsible for human rights violations too. And so, they might prefer to make deals and consolidate power at this point rather than confronting those who seek to depose them, namely former regime officials especially. So I think HTS is right in the sense that this needs to be handled delicately with regards to chemical weapons, for example. As I said, those that know where the weapons are may be perpetrators themselves. So there might need to be an uncomfortable assortment of carrots and sticks with former regime officials in order to get a hold of documentation and material. Regime officials have certainly been using Austin Tice and numerous other prisoners as leverage in that regard. So I think balancing accountability and national reconciliation, it's a sticky issue in every context, but I think HTS is moving forward with it. I'm seeing some positive signs from the international community, but I think we've seen some recent moves in the US government that I think are a bit problematic. And I'll just give one concrete example, more because time is really of the essence. But the recent freezing of state and US aid funds, for example, will have a lot of consequences for Syria. An immediate one is that US funds the White Helmet's justice and accountability work, just for one example. So, freezing funds for organizations in Syria working on investigations and accountability, let alone the much needed aid that is needed, isn't a great start. Governing actors and civil society that promote access and accountability should be rewarded so that others see the benefit of cooperation rather than being punished. Now, all of that said, despite those hurdles, I'm going to end on a high note. This is an incredible opportunity to strengthen the Chemical Weapons Convention. A regime that, as Daryl mentioned, had one of the most advanced chemical weapons arsenals in the world and used them on their own people, has been deposed. And after Assad successfully used chemical weapons against internal threats and external, he stayed in power. But I think now that he's fallen, the Syria case shows the world how dangerous it is for any regime to have these weapons. For those that weren't concerned about Assad having them, but they were concerned about a non-state armed group acquiring them, I think his fall shows how faulty that logic is when it comes to WMD-like chemical weapons, because even the most powerful states can be fragile. We know that when the mighty USSR broke apart, Russia had CW stockpiles that were ill-guarded or contained, and a desperate population that was willing to sell them to the highest bidder. So I think it's time to really push this argument more broadly, especially with the outliers, which gets me to this second and last point. I think the second reason to be optimistic is that this could be an opportunity to get universal acceptance to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Israel and Egypt are big holdouts. The Trump administration has already shown that it's willing to use its leverage to get what it wants from allies. And I think this is the time for that. The fall of Assad shows how dangerous it is to have these weapons in any country. And perhaps even China and its discomfort with upheaval could be convinced to coax the DPRK into acceptance. My colleague Doreen Horschig and I wrote a piece for CSIS on this more recently. And I would just emphasize that because the success of the CWC, of course, stems from the universal taboo on these weapons and the universality of that convention. And of course, the credibility of institutions like OPCW. I'm hoping that we'll get into that a bit more, that second point, particularly on credibility of institutions like the OPCW. We've seen a lot of issues with disinformation on this file. As someone who was working with the White Helmets, which was kind of the center of probably one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in modern history. It's a very important point. I won't get into it too much, but hopefully we can get into it in the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Natasha. Both of the presentations really complemented each other well, and I appreciate also you bringing up the universality of the CWC at the end of the presentation, which is always an important point. I think we can definitely start with your last point about the credibility of institutions and what the OPCW can do. We've received several questions all related to obstacles that the OPCW is facing in taking swift action or responding to this change. So if you could both address challenges that the OPCW is facing and elaborate a bit more, since I know you touched on both of that, you both touched on that. Challenges that the OPCW is facing and potential paths forward.
Sure. So, I mean, the obstacle is the need for the Syrian government to provide more information to the OPCW and make a new declaration, start engaging with the organization. Obviously, the Syrian Foreign Ministry is taking some time to rebuild. They've kind of deputized Qatar as the representative at the OPCW, so there is a kind of a formal means of channel of communication, but there hasn't been any direct, as far as I know, any direct engagement between Damascus and OPCW. And so that's really what needs to get started. And I would hope that the Syrians would be able to, welcome a delegation from OPCW in the near future to start going over these issues and start prioritizing. So that's kind of the first step. And the second step will have to do a lot with the situation on the ground in terms of both the knowledge about locations of materials that are of interest, but also kind of the security situation. And maybe I'll let Natasha kind of fill in on that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I won't get into the sort of credibility issues with the OPCW right away, but I think that that's a considerable broader point that the OPCW and the U.S. government really needs to think about for the future. I mean, in terms of the obstacles for the OPCW, Greg mentioned some of them. Really, again, time is of the essence. It's really the Wild West right now in Syria. I've heard of people getting access to documents that they really shouldn't have access to when it comes to accountability efforts. I suspect it's similar for not just the disappeared and prisons, but all sorts of issues, including chemical weapons. It's been really difficult even for the White Helmets to get permissions from various authorities to reach certain areas. They have a hazmat team, for example, so they have been experienced with acquiring evidence, especially after the Khan Sheikhoun case in 2017. So again, I think all of this just needs to be facilitated a little bit more quickly. We've seen documents, databases stolen from prisons. It's unclear if they're being used as leverage. It probably is the case that they are, but some have just simply been looted too. And so I think, once again, I know security is an issue, but that said, there's a lot of people going into Syria right now. And so I think what needs to happen is I think credible investigators need to be going in really post haste. The security situation is difficult, but it is manageable, I think, in some targeted locations.
Okay, we also have a question about how to incentivize the interim government to fully and quickly cooperate with international disposal efforts, while balancing the need to pursue justice, and what, in your opinion, would be the best risk prioritization approach to take in such disposal efforts?
I think we've already seen some signs when the French and German foreign ministers went to Damascus. They did put security of chemical weapons, disposal of chemical weapons, on the agenda. So this is one of their conditions for aid. So I think that they said that there needs to be a unified front among all the countries that have either imposed sanctions on Syria, and so Syria wants those sanctions lifted, or in a position to offer reconstruction aid, such as Saudi Arabia, some of the Gulf Arab states. Those countries all need to be on the same page in terms of, having Syrian full compliance with OPCW and the Chemical Weapons Convention be one of the conditions for normalizations of relations with the new government, and for the lifting of sanctions and the flow of aid and reconstruction. And given the points that Natasha already made, it's clearly in the very strong material interest of the new government to accede to these requests or these conditions, but I think it needs to be unified, and this needs to be a high profile issue and not kind of buried in the footnote somewhere. And there have been definitely some good signs that certain countries have made this a key point. It's not clear to me that all countries really are on the same page, and so there needs to be kind of unified international front that this is a high priority issue that needs to get resolved. And if the Syrian government cooperates fully, and if there's enough security on the ground, I think this could be resolved, fairly quickly, given that the conditions are nowhere near as bad as they were in 2014.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add to that is this is a worry for many different things in Syria. I mean, there has been a lot of attention to Syria, but I do fear that it's being put back on the back burner. There have obviously been a lot of high-profile visits, I think exceeding 200, with HTS since they sort of came into power. But a lot of it, a lot of the demands in return for sanctions being lifted or aid are kind of a laundry list of things that aren't very specific, like an inclusive governance. It's unclear what that actually means. The benefit of chemical weapons is that we can show a very detailed step-for-step process for investigators to come in. Now, I said that there's a lot of difficulties that the current government cannot sort of fully address because of security issues in certain areas, because of who might be controlling some of the remnants of the chemical weapons stockpile. But still, there should be investigators coming in. We've seen UN officials going in, and so there shouldn't be any delay with regards to those processes and steps. And so, I think that there just needs to be a little bit sort of firmer movement. And unfortunately, with the chemical weapons file, this is something that is quite easy to point to. The disposal of it is a different story, but at least you can start moving across those steps that Greg just mentioned in return for many of the things that Syria desperately needs.
Could I just mention one more item? As the Biden administration was exiting the stage late last year, the National Security Council made it clear that for the Biden administration, they had made the future of Syria's chemical stockpile a priority after the fall of the Assad regime. And so in their early communications with the emerging new government in Syria, I mean, that was an item that they had flagged. We've not yet heard from the Trump administration on this point. Of course, it's very early days. But this is, I'm sure, I don't know for certain, certainly likely something that was discussed between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the current National Security Advisor, Mr. Waltz. So this is an issue that I think the press needs to be following up on because, as Natasha and Greg said, I mean, this is an urgent issue. The situation on the ground in Syria is very fluid, and time is of the essence with respect to getting UN and OPCW people there to assess what we can about the remnants.
Yeah, Darrell, if I could just follow up on that, I haven't yet seen anything either directly from the Trump administration about where serious compliance with the CWC falls in their kind of priority list. But I will note that the first Trump administration did take a lot of very strong actions to reduce the threat posed by serious chemical weapons. The Trump administration launched 2 missile strikes on Syrian facilities related to chemical weapons after the attacks on Khan Sheikhoun and Douma. The Trump administration also imposed sanctions on hundreds of SSRC scientists who would help develop these chemical weapons, and led some efforts at OPCW to impose more costs on Syria for their non-compliance. So Trump administration actually has a strong track record previously on this issue, and so hopefully this will come back up on their agenda, and they'll make it a priority again and take some of the actions that you and I and Natasha have been talking about.
If I could just chip in on something slightly unrelated, but related to what Greg just said on those strikes. GPPI and other think tanks have noted, not sure if it's correlation or causation, but after those strikes, after that 2017 strike, after the sarin gas attack on Khan Sheikhoun, we didn't see any more sarin gas attacks. After the strike, after the Douma strike in 2018 with chlorine gas, we didn't see any more chlorine gas attacks. And so just something to keep in mind in terms of deterrence for the future. Those were very limited strikes. I think the air base that was hit after the Khan Sheikhoun attack was back online the next day. But at least it signals that this is an actual red line, I think, for the international community, or for the United States at least.
Okay, we also have some questions about how Russia and Iran are responding to this, or what the role or the response from former allies of the Assad regime has been.
I mean, the short answer is they're not happy. Both Russia and Iran invested a lot of blood and treasure in propping up the Assad regime. And all that investment has now been erased because the new government is, I think, hostile to both those governments. Russia has been moving to try and replace their presence from their bases in Syria with a new presence in Libya. Iran has suffered a lot of losses also in terms of its ally Hezbollah, which also was propping up the Assad regime. So I think both those governments are been very strongly disadvantaged by the developments in Syria. I don't know to what extent this will affect the chemical file, either at OPCW or on the ground. There are reports that Russia airlifted 4,000 Iranian advisors out of Syria when the Assad regime fell apart. I don't know to what extent there are potentially former Syrian regime officials who are part of that, who are war criminals or maybe one for war crimes. And of course, the Russians are offering refuge to Bashar al-Assad. And so that is going to be a major sticking point between any improved relations between Syria and Russia. And just the last point on that is the French government has been pursuing a court case against Assad and some of his senior aides for their use of chemical weapons in Ghouta in 2013. That's still kind of going through the process, but there could be fresh arrest warrants issued for Assad to stand trial in France. And even without him being extradited from Russia, which obviously is extremely unlikely, that trial could be held in absentia. And so there might actually be some legal progress on accountability here in France, even though Russia and Iran will not cooperate with that process.
But I would.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, one point about the role of Russia going forward, as I mentioned at the very opening, the chemical weapons demilitarization process in 2013-14, that was only possible with Russia's support and cooperation and recognition that the failure to stop Assad from using those chemical weapons at the time and eliminating them could lead to American military intervention and the fall of the regime at the time. That helped motivate the Russians at the time, and their interests and American interests were at that time aligned. And then, of course, after that operation, and as Russia inserted its military forces to back up Assad in the middle of the civil war, Russia's attitude about cooperation with the US, the international community, the OPCW changed markedly. So the question that was just raised about the reactions of Russia, I would just note that this is an interesting opportunity for Russia to adjust its approach, because now it is in Russia's interest, in the interest of all states in the region, to account for any vestigial CW precursor chemicals, stockpiles, capabilities, so that they are not diffused, transferred, lost, et cetera, as Greg was outlining. So it will be interesting to see how Russia might adjust its position regarding the important role that the OPCW plays in investigating the situation on the ground. I would hope that Russia, well, it may not be the champion of these efforts, it will not be an impediment to helping get the OPCW and the Executive Council, the UN Security Council, aligned to do what's necessary in the weeks and months ahead. So I think we should also be looking to see how Mr. Putin adjusts Russia's position on this particular aspect of the Syria aftermath situation.
So I'm not sure if the question was specifically related to chemical weapons or generally what Iran and Russia plan to do now. But for a longer response to what Russia and China will do now, I did a podcast with my former colleague Hannah Notte called Russian Roulette, where we talk about that pretty extensively. But when it comes to the chemical weapons file, I think Daryl is right. Russia might be willing to exchange quite a bit in return for some kind of control over its bases in Syria, particularly the naval port. In that discussion, we get into a little bit of the technical reasons why it's quite difficult for Russia to replace Tartus. It was always a sort of minor facility, about 11 vessels there and a handful of auxiliaries. But for an assortment of other reasons, it's quite difficult to move all of that to Libya. Some of that is being moved to Libya. Sudan is obviously less of a alternative at the moment. But and that's what we're seeing with the deputy foreign minister sort of in Damascus shaking hands with the Shara. Which is quite incredible if you think about Russia's role in this war more broadly. But certainly this is potentially an opportunity. That said, I do think Russia will potentially double down on disinformation. So whatever it says publicly from its official channels of diplomats, it might double down with disinformation when it comes to the OPCW and Syria and other cases more broadly.
Okay, I think we are getting close to the end of the session, so we have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have two related questions about civil society. So the first one is asking, how can civil society contribute constructively towards addressing the issue of the remaining stockpiles and encouraging HTS to implement Syria's obligations under the CWC, if at all, at this point? And also, relatedly, did the recent CWC emergency meeting discuss support for victims in Syria? Does Syria need to get its rights and privileges under the CWC restored before it could engage and benefit from the OPCW's designated support network for CW victims?
In the interest of time, I'll just take the civil society question and leave the second one to either Daryl or Greg. Civil society can do a lot, and they are already doing a lot. I mean, Syrian civil society is quite robust. So even just talking today, I've spoken to people that are tracking some of the potential persecutors, where they have run to, where they have fled, how to track sort of financial networks with regards to them. So it's not just civil society in as far as collecting evidence on, within Syria when it comes to mass graves and chemical weapons attacks, but it's also tracking the perpetrators. So there's quite a bit that civil society can and has been doing, including establishing even a separate tribunal with a handful of states all over the world, specifically to go after chemical weapons violators in particular. One would hope that this is an opportunity, as Daryl mentioned, to make it a bit more of a universal process. But that said, there's quite a lot to feed off of there.
Yeah, and in terms of the second part of the question, Syria can't get its rights and privileges back until it comes to compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention, and what it needs to do is laid out in decisions by the Executive Council. So that's the onus is on the Syrian government to do that. But I do think it is important moving forward that as part of the accountability effort, that there is also aid and assistance and support for survivors and victims of the chemical attacks in Syria, not just from a legal perspective, but also medical, psychological, mental health, because these were incredibly traumatic events, and so it would be great for OPCW, other states, and civil society to be able to support the victims and survivors moving forward, and hopefully the sooner the Syrian government can resolve these compliance issues, right, the sooner that there can be more organized support for survivors and victims.
Okay, we have a lot of questions that I don't think we'll have time to get to today. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions and who attended the webinar. It was really a great turnout for us, and we really appreciate everybody's interest. If you'd like to connect with us more, please, as I said, follow the CWC Coalition on our social media and visit our website. This webinar recording will be posted on our all of our social media, our YouTube, and also shared in an email to the coalition and any interested public within the next 2 weeks. So thank you again to everybody for joining, and thank you to Daryl, Greg, Natasha, and yeah, thank you again to our audience.
Thank you as well. And thanks everyone for.
Goodbye. Thanks.